Hi folks, this is Irene with BrainStormAcres, and today this video is for Dan at home with the sticks, because the other day we watched him make his 9th Ward pecan pie and we decided it sounds really delicious, so we're going to make it. But first, I've got to make the crust. When my kids were little, I admit, I did not make crust from scratch. I learned to make crust from my mom when I was a little bitty kid. But with 2 kids running around and soccer and this and that and the other thing, it was way easier to buy a pie crust at the grocery store. But then something most unfortunate happened. My favorite recipes all changed to canola oil as their oil. And I mean my favorite crusts. All of a sudden I couldn't eat them anymore. So I went, okay, can't buy any, they won't make me sick. I will make my own again. So I dragged out my mom's old recipe. Now I have to admit, I haven't made a single crust pie in a long time, because most of the time when we make pies, we make 2 at a time. But I do have the recipe. So I'll make sure that I get a screenshot of that for later. But it's super simple. And I wanted to do this specifically for Dan because he said nobody ever taught him how, and it's super simple. So first we need a bowl, 1.5 cups of flour. So there's a cup, and there's a half. And then we need 3/4 teaspoon of salt. And we're just going to sift these together. What that does is it takes out all the lumps. You know, sometimes salt will stick together, sometimes your flour will have a little bit of lumps in it. Well, this mixes it together while it's taking out all the lumps. And I can see there's some lumps down in here. So I'm just going to mash those with my thumb, because we don't need any lumps. There we go. Now, I need 1/2 cup of shortening and 1.5 tablespoons of butter. Now, you can use whatever kind of shortening you like. This is regular old Crisco, and this video is not sponsored by Crisco. Good leaf lard works beautifully. If you wanted to switch all to butter, I'm not sure it would work exactly right, but that's your choice. Do whatever works for you. And I try and be pretty tidy about getting all that stuff out of here, because it's measured for a reason. That's so that you get everything in there. Now, and then we need 1.5 tablespoons of butter. Now that I've got it all in there, all I have to do is cut it together. Now, I have a pastry cutter. It was one of the first things I bought when I got married, because I knew I'd need one. If you don't have one, just use 2 knives, hold them like that, and cut it like that. Works the same way. The whole point is to cut the butter and shortening up into very small pieces and distribute them evenly through the flour and salt mixture. You might want to use a little bit bigger bowl than I did here. It's a little messy if you do it in a smaller bowl. I usually do this in a giant bowl because I'm usually making 2 pie crusts at a time. And all I'm going to do is spend a minute or so here chopping this up until it looks kind of coarse. Some people will say, like when you're doing biscuits or something, somebody will say sometimes do it so that you have pea-sized pieces or something like that. I usually do it smaller than that, but I do scrape it a couple times like this because I can see there's a couple of spots where it's mostly shortening or mostly butter, and I want to get it mixed pretty good together. It doesn't have to be perfect. It works better if it's a little bit better distributed. Okay, good enough. Now, I need to add 3 tablespoons of water. Now, I didn't measure that out ahead of time. And the reason I didn't is we live in Arizona specifically. And that creates an interesting problem for us. A lot of times our flour is actually very, very dry. Now I keep it in a closed container and all that kind of stuff, but when I buy it, it comes in a paper bag, just like most flour does, and it actually dehydrates in the grocery store, just sitting around. So we have often got to add more liquid than a recipe calls for. But I recommend that people start with 3 tablespoons, and you can always add more, but it sure is hard to take it out. So I got my measuring spoon. Make sure this water is not hot. What I normally do is run the tap. If your groundwater is super warm, you might want to consider actually chilling it in the fridge or something a little bit. What you want is you want something that's going to help your shortenings stay shortening. You don't want them to melt and get squishy, because that'll make your dough tough. You want to work this as little as possible. My instructions say add those 3 tablespoons of water to the flour mix and then let it rest for 2 minutes. So I'll see you in 2 minutes. It's 2 minutes, and it's magical how some of the stuff got cleaned off the counter, but not all of it. Anyway, now that it's rested for 2 minutes, now you might say, why are you letting it rest for 2 minutes? Well, what you want is you want the water to start sort of seeping around into the flour so that you're not having to stir it as much. Then I'm going to take a fork and I'm going to gently stir this and try and get the moisture through here. Now you notice I'm not beating the stuffings out of it. If I was going to beat the stuffings out of it, I would use a spoon. You want to get in there and just kind of cut it through gently. Now it's looking okay so far. Not sure it's going to be quite enough moisture, but for most people, that should be the right amount. Now, the way you'll know whether you have enough moisture in there or not is by how much it sticks together. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to get a piece of any kind of cling wrap. I just happen to own Saran wrap right now. Usually we use some sort of a commercial brand that's cheaper, that comes from one of the big box stores. And I'm going to put this down on the counter, which was completely clean before I spilled flour all over it. And then I'm going to, and I'm looking at this and I'm seeing how crumbly it is. Looks like it's going to stick together pretty well. So I'm going to pour this out onto my Saran wrap carefully so as to make sure that 99% of it stays on the Saran wrap. It doesn't scoot across the counter. Okay. All little bitty pieces. All right. Now you notice still a little bit of crumbliness to it, but what I'm going to do is I'm going to squish it together like this. And generally speaking, when I squish, it's staying together pretty well. Now the biggest mistake that most people make with their crust that makes them tough and not flaky is they beat the you-know-what out of it. They have nice warm hands, they sort of cuddle it a lot, and that's not good for your dough. I'm touching it as little as possible. It's sticking together pretty well. So what I'm going to do now is I am going to wrap this guy up nice and tight so that he keeps all his moisture in there. And I'm going to stick him in the fridge for probably a half an hour. It says 20 to 30 minutes. I usually let it go to the 30 side of that. So I will see you again in half an hour. Well, it's a half an hour later, and our dough is nice and chilled from being in the fridge. So what I have is I have a mat here. This happens to be a silicone mat. You can use whatever surface you usually roll your dough on. I'm going to touch this as little as possible. Put it out. See how it goes. Now what I'm going to do here is I'm going to get my rolling pin just a little bit. Now, if I squished this like this and it didn't crack it all around the edges, I would be concerned that maybe I got a little too squishy. But what that half hour of resting in the fridge does is it lets the moisture that you put in there get throughout the entire piece of dough, so that you're not having to add a lot of, you're not trying to make a paste. You don't want it to be too squishy. There are types of dough that are squishy, but crust doughs are not usually squishy. So all I'm doing is moving this around. Now, if it doesn't come up perfectly, if it breaks, you can fix it. It's not gonna, it may not look like the most perfect dough you've ever seen anywhere, but it's still gonna taste good and it'll still work just fine. Edges tend to crack off a little bit. That's okay. I'm just sticking them back on there. All right. I got my pie pan here. I'm going to scrape off the extra dough that's got squishy. Squish it back on there. If your dough doesn't stick back together, now mine seems to be pretty spot on today, but if it doesn't stick back together, you can add a tiny bit of water on your finger and just put it on the dough, and it'll glue it back together. All right. Now, here's the big test. Let's see if it sticks to the silicone pad or not. Sometimes it does and sometimes it doesn't. But one of the reasons I chose a silicone pad is it's less likely to stick to that than anything else I own. I used to have a really nice cover for my rolling pin and my, now see if it's sticking a little bit like that, there we go. And also for to roll dough out on. And one of the times that we moved, it got damaged. So I never went back to using that system. I could, but this works well enough. Okay. There we go. Woo, not too bad. Trying to be as gentle as I can. Now, different people like to finish the edges of their pie different ways. I'm going to gently push this down in there because I don't want it to be on an angle like that. I want it to be down in that corner sort of the bottom of the pie shell. There we go. Now, I'm just going to use this because I have it here. You can use a knife. You can do all kinds of different things. I'm going to set the extras over here. And then I'll use those to piece anything that didn't come out exactly the way I want it. I haven't done pies in a while, so I'm a little rusty. But that's okay. We don't bake much here in the summertime. It's just plain too hot. And we do not have AC in the main part of the house. We do have the ability to make some air conditioning for the bedroom, but that's it. Because we're off grid, so we'd have to have a lot more solar or wind or batteries or all of the above in order to be able to do whole house air conditioning. So just like in the summertime, I mean in the wintertime rather, some people will only heat part of their house and sort of shut the rest of it up. If it gets really, really hot, we have to do sort of the same thing. We'll go hide in the bedroom. Of course, we do the same thing if it gets incredibly cold too. We have a pellet stove in the bedroom, so you can always hunker down there. You just bring your cat and dog and everybody gets comfy in there. Do not feel that you need to use all of this dough. This recipe has always made a little bit extra, and for some of the pies that we make, we actually make cutouts and put them on top, like for pumpkin pies. We actually did a video last year for our Pompion tart, which is a pumpkin pie from a 1500s recipe. It's one of our very favorite things in the world. There we go. Now, if I want to make this a little fancier, I can decorate the edges somehow. I can crimp it. My mom used to be really good at crimping. I haven't crimped in years, but I could just take a fork and make a little design around the edge. Or you can just leave it completely plain. It doesn't make any difference. It's still going to taste good. That's why I say when people say, oh, it's not perfect, yeah, but it's how it tastes that really counts. And this is going to look good enough. Now, if I was making a pie that needed to have the pie shell baked ahead of time, this is the point at which I would fill the bottom in here with dried beans or clay weights. I actually own clay weights, but I haven't made any pies in a while. They work just like dry beans, except you're not roasting any beans. You fill it in there, follow the instructions, and bake it. And that keeps your pie shell from buckling and doing funky things. But this guy here is all ready to go. This pie dough that's left over here, I can, when I actually go to bake the pie, I can roll this out again and put it in the oven with some jam filling or something like that, or I could make another little tart. So I never let this stuff go to waste. I'm going to wrap this up to keep it from drying out. Obviously, it's not complicated. Not at all. But it's super easy. So Dan, now you know how to make a pie crust. It's not hard. If you can make all those fancy sauces and, oh Lord, all the things you do, you won't have any trouble with this at all. I hope it inspires everybody to make their own pie crust, whether they're out of them at the store or whether you just want to try having control over what you put into your own pie crust. These will be delicious and crispy and flaky. Just remember, don't work them too hard. Don't touch them more than you need to. It's when you work them that they get tough. So until next time, bye. Oh, and if you like this, be sure to hit that like button. And if you like more videos like this, then you should subscribe and be sure to hit that notification bell so that you know when we've made more videos. Bye.